Hello everyone, back to the lesson Respiration in Organisms. Now, as we discussed respiration in various organisms, right? Let us complete this lesson with respiration in human beings. That is respiration in us. Now, how is that? The air enters into our body. First, we'll look into the pathway of the air, how it reaches our respiratory organs. Now, what are the respiratory organs in us? That is the lungs. Fine. Now, we'll start the pathway for the air, how it enters into the lungs. Now, as such, the air enters into our body through nostrils, right? From the nostrils, it enters into a cavity called as nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, it enters into a structure called as pharynx. Pharynx is a common passage for both digestive system as well as respiratory system. From pharynx, it enters into another structure called as larynx, which we call it as a voice box, where we have vocal cords from where, because of vibration, the sound is being produced. From larynx, air enters into a tube-like structure, that is trachea. Trachea, as soon as it reaches our lungs. Now, where are our lungs present? Right, in the chest cavity. The lungs are present in the chest cavity. So, as soon as trachea reaches our lungs, it branches into two. Now, those branches are called as bronchi. And this bronchi, after entering into their respective lungs, divides into many branches. They are called as bronchioles. Now these bronchioles enter into the units of lungs, what we call it as alveoli. Right? Alveoli are called as units of lungs. That means billions of alveoli are present in our lungs. So these alveoli part makes a lung. Now from the alveoli, air enters into our blood. So this is what we call the pathway of air entering into our lungs and then into our blood. So as such, our respiratory system begins with the nostrils, enters into the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, this is the trachea. You can feel the trachea when you touch your neck part. They are C-shaped cartilaginous rings which you can also feel. So that is trachea. As soon as it reaches the lungs, it branches into two. That is what we call it as bronchi. And then these branches are called as bronchioles, and these bronchioles enters into each and every alveolus. So that is how the respiratory system or the pathway of air where the air reaches the lungs. Now we'll look into. Now how is that the mechanism of breathing taking place? Now as such, there's another important part in our body in the chest cavity is the diaphragm, which is somewhat dome shaped, right? Which is a somewhat dome shaped. This plays an important role in our respiratory system. Now, as such, mechanism of breathing involves inhalation and exhalation. Now, for example, now you take in air, a long breathe, taken a long breath inside. When you are taking air inside, you feel your chest cavity has increased. So, as such, during inhalation, okay, now we are discussing about the mechanism of respiration. So, during that, the first part is inhalation. Now, during inhalation, what happens? Here, the diaphragm, which I told you, plays a major role in respiration, right? It contracts. That means it becomes flat. When it becomes flat, there's lots of space being created in the lungs. So as such, the volume of the lung increases. Now naturally, when volume increases, according to your physics, the pressure decreases. When volume is more, the pressure is reduced. Now as such, air from outside diffuses inside. So that is how air through this pathway enters into the lungs. Now what happens during inhalation? The diaphragm contracts, becomes flattened, right? And thus it increases the volume of the lungs. When the volume of the lungs increases, the pressure decreases. And thus the air from outside enters into our lungs. That is what happens in inhalation. Now, how is exhalation happening? Here the diaphragm comes back to its dome shape, to its original position. When it comes back to the original position, what happens to the volume? That is decreased. When volume is decreased, the pressure is increased. Now, as a result, the air from inside the lungs is being expelled out through the same pathway. So that is what is called as exhalation. Now, is it clear? Inhalation and exhalation with the help of diaphragm helps in the process of breathing. Fine? Shall we move on? So that is what is called as breathing mechanism. Now, you might have noticed, right? The rate of breathing, right? The amount of oxygen you take in. Sometimes in our daily activities, somewhere you find it is increasing, somewhere you find it is decreasing. Can you recollect and tell me when is that the rate of respiration increases? Right. That is when you run, jump, do some exercises, then the rate of breathing increases. Whereas when you are at rest, when you are sitting, watching television, right, at that time it is a bit slow, right? So that is what is the difference in the breathing rate. The rate of respiration differs from one person to the other person. Depends upon its position. What is the activity he is doing? It also differs at age. Young age in children, it is more when compared to the adults, right? The age also it matters. Now we'll move on to the next part where I have written all the parts of your respiratory system. Now, in a very short way or short form, I'll tell you the functions. First and foremost, nostrils is through which the air enters. Then comes the nasal cavity. You can feel your nasal cavity. Look up, see into the mirror. There you can see small hair-like structures inside your nasal cavity. Now, what is this? Why are these hairs being present? And sometimes you have that sticky substance called mucus, sometimes irritating your nasal cavities. Now, this mucus and hair, it protects us from any dust particles entering into the respiratory tract. They prevent the dust particles entering into the respiratory tract. Because the respiratory tract here I have drawn it a little bit broader, but it is very thin enough. It cannot get in, or the dust particles, if at all by mistake it enters also, it blocks the respiratory tract. Is that clear? So that's the reason we have hair as well as mucus glands in the nasal cavity which will prevent the dust particles to enter. Then from the nasal cavity I told you pharynx. Pharynx common passage, right? So as such you can observe this. When you are swallowing the food, you cannot breathe, right? Test it. When you are eating your food today, test it. When you are swallowing the food, you are not breathing for that second. Is that clear? It's not munching. I am telling you, when you swallow the food, you cannot breathe because your structure called as epiglottis, which is present in the pharynx, it closes the respiratory tract. Why is it closing? As I told you, even a smallest dust particle cannot enter into the respiratory tract. How is that? The food materials can enter. So that's the reason our elders tell us not to talk while we eat. Now sometimes if we are in a hurry completing a lunch. It chokes sometimes. You get hiccups, right? You get hiccups. Sometimes you sneeze. When you sneeze, what happens? Some of the food particles from your nose will come out, right? So that is where it is protecting our respiratory tract. Then comes larynx. Larynx, also called as voice box. So larynx consists of vocal cords, right? When the air enters over these vocal cords, the vibration is being created, and that's how sound is produced. Larynx is also called as, or commonly called as, voice box. Then comes trachea. The other name for trachea is windpipe. Food pipe you learn, digestive system, esophagus. Now trachea is called as a windpipe where air passes through the trachea. It consists of these C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Then comes your bronchi. As I told you, as soon as it reaches the lungs, the trachea divides into two branches because we have a pair of lungs in the chest cavity protected by a ribs which form a cage. We call it as rib cage. So the lungs are being protected by the rib cage. In between the lungs, what do you have? The most important organ in our body, that is the heart. Okay, fine. Then comes your lungs, right? Then comes your lungs, which consists of numerous smaller structures called as alveoli. Plural alveoli, right? Singular alveolus. So as such, those are called as units of lungs where actually the exchange of gases takes place. Fine? So these are the functions of these parts in your respiratory system. Now we'll move on with the exchange of gases. I'll just describe you how the exchange of gases takes place in alveoli. That is also something very interesting where we are eager to know about the respiratory system. How is this exchange of gases taking place? Now, as such, in the lungs, assume in the lungs you have, right, these structures where we call it as alveoli, right? Assume this as a group of alveoli, group of cells, units of lungs called as alveoli. So here each and every alveoli, right, is surrounded by the blood vessel. It is surrounded by the blood vessel. Now, for example, if I treat that alveoli as a single cell, then you will understand a little bit better. Assume this is alveoli. Fine. This is being surrounded by, right? This is being surrounded by the blood capillaries, right? Blood capillaries. Now here inside the alveoli, you are going to tell me the sum. Inside the alveoli, what is more, oxygen or carbon dioxide? Because air is coming in with oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. Fine. So here you have oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. Whereas this is the blood vessel. Now this blood vessel which is surrounding the alveoli, fine, this also consists of, or it is coming from the different parts of our body. So as such, it is bringing more of carbon dioxide and it has very less of oxygen. Now when we are talking about blood vessels, just to recollect your transport system, the blood vessels are of two types, arteries and veins. Arteries and veins. These are distributing, these are collecting blood vessels. So usually these arteries, when they are entering into smaller cells, they divide into smaller branches and we call them as capillaries. We call them as capillaries. So this is what is called as your blood capillary. Here, which consists of, it is coming from different parts of the body. So it's consisting of more of carbon dioxide and less of oxygen. Now this alveoli, where you are taking in air inhalation, it consists of more of oxygen and less of carbon dioxide. Then with the process of diffusion, what happens? Oxygen from the alveoli enters into the blood capillaries, and carbon dioxide, which is more in the blood capillaries, from the blood capillaries enters into the alveoli. Because after inhalation, the next process is exhalation, such that the carbon dioxide from the alveoli is back again into the atmosphere during the exhalation process. So this is how exchange of gases take place. Is that clear? Now coming to the last part, what we were discussing about cellular respiration. Now how is that the blood is capable of carrying this oxygen to different parts of our body? Now, what is the color of our blood? Right? Red in color. Why it is red? Fine. Because of the pigment present. Because of the pigment present in our blood. What is the pigment? Fine. That is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a pigment present in our blood. One more interesting thing related to hemoglobin is it has a binding capacity. It can bind to oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules, and that is how it can distribute or help in exchange of gases. Now, as such, assume this as a cell, right? Assume this as a cell wherein oxygen is being utilized. Oxygen is of very less amount, whereas carbon dioxide is of a large, because it is continuously performing its activities. It's also breathing, so it is giving out, taking in oxygen present and giving out carbon dioxide. Now this blood, when it is reaching, okay, when it is reaching the cell, the blood which is having hemoglobin present in it, right? So this hemoglobin from the lungs, when it is coming, it is binding up with oxygen, and we call that as oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin enters inside the cell. Now as such, oxygen from the hemoglobin enters inside the cell, and this carbon dioxide, which is more, it diffuses back into the hemoglobin. So that is what occurs during cellular respiration. This I explained you in alveoli of the lungs, how the blood takes in the oxygen and gives away the carbon dioxide into the alveoli. Here, inside the cell, that is cellular respiration, wherein the blood, which consists of hemoglobin, the pigment, it is binding up with oxygen and forming oxyhemoglobin and enters into the cell. And that's how it gives the oxygen to the cell and carries the carbon dioxide prepared from the cell to the lungs back again. So that is what is called as cellular respiration. Is that fine? Right. Now, last video, when I was concluding it, I just asked you all about the pores or the respiration in plants. Fine, very good. The respiration in plants takes place through small structures, which we have already discussed, stomata on the leaves as well as lenticels on the stem. So through these pores, the process of respiration occurs even in plants. They also take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. Because many of the students make this as a mistake. Whenever we ask, how is that the exchange? How is that the process of respiration takes place in plants? They just blindly give this answer. They take in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. That taking in carbon dioxide and giving out oxygen is the process of photosynthesis, not respiration. Respiration is same for all the living organisms. We take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. Now you might have understood the role of oxygen in our body. Is that clear? Fine. Thank you. Bye.